Good to go.
Hi there, everybody. My name's Jane Anderson. I'm founder and co-director of Local Contexts, and we're going to give you a little bit of a presentation about local context. There are probably some of you out there who have heard of it, and we're just really grateful to Cassandra, Julia, and the larger NMLA members to be able to bring this to you today. I'm coming to you from Lenape-Hoking, lands of the Lenape Nations. Corrie and then Felicia, do you want to just quickly introduce yourselves as well?
Yeah, hi, thanks everyone. Thanks again so much for having us. It's great to see some familiar names here. My name's Corrie Rowe. I'm a settler here. I'm coming to you from what is known as Connecticut. I'm based on Paugussett and Wabanger homelands, and I'm the Local Context Institution Outreach Manager. So Felicia?
Thanks, Corrie. Hi, everyone. I'm Felicia Garcia. I'm Somali Chumash, and I'm lucky to be based on my homelands in Southern California, though I previously lived in Santa Fe for the past 4 years, so it's fun to be in conversation with you all. And I work for Local Context as the Community Outreach Manager, so I have the privilege of supporting Indigenous communities who are interested in our programs. Good to see you all today.
So we want to begin with a land acknowledgement for us and for our organisation that transcends both geographic boundaries. We're not only based in what's currently known as the United States, we're also spread across in Aotearoa, New Zealand as well. But we want to acknowledge the lands and the waters that we occupy are Indigenous homelands. And we want to acknowledge the significance of these lands and waters for Indigenous peoples in the past, present and the future. And we do this land acknowledgement as kind of part of recognising and addressing and naming the violence of settler colonialism and its ongoing effects, which is really central to the work that we do. And particularly how settler colonialism has kind of manifested in structural exclusions and erasure of Indigenous peoples within institutions that steward collections of Indigenous heritage and data. That kind of misinformation or absence of information within institutions and their systems continues to pose enduring challenges and adversely affect Indigenous peoples. So we really believe that we have responsibilities and obligations to support Indigenous peoples, communities and organisations really in overcoming some of these legacies of settler colonialism, and particularly because Local Context was developed to create different kinds of pathways for implementing and maintaining Indigenous data rights and authority back into collections and for Indigenous futures. So we kind of ask that we all acknowledge these truths and join us in that commitment to act as respectful guests within Indigenous homelands in which we live and in which we work. So just an overview of kind of how we're going to do this presentation today. We're going to start talking a little bit about Indigenous data sovereignty, then a little bit of background to Local Context and the team. We're going to talk about Local Context notices first. Then we'll move to the traditional knowledge and biocultural labels. And then we'll talk a little bit about the technical implementation through the Local Context hub of these particular tools. So just beginning with Indigenous data sovereignty, I'm sure many of you are familiar or have kind of like intersected with kind of these thoughts about Indigenous data sovereignty, which is really a growing movement that really connects into already existing discourses around Indigenous rights and interests, from treaty rights to intellectual and cultural property rights to Indigenous research ethics and data ethics. And the two main tenets of Indigenous data sovereignty are data for governance. So that means gaining access to use data to transform the lives of Indigenous people and making sure that Indigenous peoples have access to the data that's been produced about them over these long histories of colonialism, but also happening today, as well as governance of data. So getting access to that data means that Indigenous communities can actually make decisions about how to use that data in ways that, that benefit Indigenous communities into the future. Some of the work that we've been doing is supporting the development of the CARE principles. The CARE principles for Indigenous data governance were developed in 2019. These were developed to sit alongside the FAIR principles, which are very data-centric principles around how data should be made findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. An Indigenous approach to these principles led to the development of the CARE principles, which are a little bit more human-centered in the sense that they center collective benefit, accountability to control, authority to control, responsibility, and ethics. So the CARE principles, there's a lot of conversation and a lot of work being done to both develop criteria for compliance around the CARE principles, as well as operationalizing the CARE principles within institutional contexts. The CARE principles also have a variety of work that's occurring in Indigenous contexts around different kinds of tribal codes and tribal institutional review boards that are being developed, as well as kind of different data access protocols and tribal guidelines that are also being developed not only in the United States, but across the world. Where we intersect with the CARE principles is really in the kind of around collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility for the labels, but also responsibility and ethics with the notices. And this kind of helps in the use of the local context tools is really kind of seen as one way that one can start operationalizing the CARE principles within an institutional context. So just a little bit of background. These are the founders and current co-directors of local context. There's myself, Maui Hudson, who's from the Whakatohea Nation in Etaroa, James Eric Francis, who is the tribal historian at the Penobscot Nation in Maine, and Kim Kristen, who is at Washington State University. So just to kind of lay out some of the problems that led to the development of local context, I have an intellectual property law background, and I've been working for Indigenous communities for the last 25 years, both in terms of getting access to collections, but also dealing with some of the legacies of copyright law, particularly how copyright law has kind of functioned as a tool of dispossession of Indigenous knowledge. So in this work, really kind of that's brought to the fore that really every Indigenous community has enormous collections that are in museums, archives, and libraries and other data repositories. And kind of what some of the problems of that are is that there is just missing information, missing provenance information, missing community names. It becomes very difficult to utilize that material. There's also, from a legal standpoint, because of the histories of copyright, Indigenous communities are largely not the legal rights holders of that material. And what that means is that Indigenous communities have very little decision-making and control over the kind of future use and future circulation of that material. This is not only a historical problem, this is one that is perpetuated in the present. There are even more researchers working and collecting data and samples from Indigenous communities than ever before. And many of our kind of research paradigms haven't really changed in relationship to how ownership of those materials is vested and also kind of thought about from a researcher standpoint. What this also means is as these collections that have kind of impoverished information alongside them, as they're digitized with the kind of efforts around open access, that many of these mistakes and kind of incomplete metadata continue into the digital lives of this material. So we know that collections are constantly being made. We're not just dealing with historical collections, we're also dealing with the collections that are coming into institutions now and will be for as we keep kind of moving into the future. So one of the big questions that arise when kind of thinking about Indigenous data sovereignty is how can you govern Indigenous data if you can't actually find Indigenous data? And so this is kind of an example of a box that I'm sure many of you would be familiar with that kind of sits within the stacks within an institutional context that actually has Indigenous data in it, but it's not findable. This is not kind of information that is connected to the finding aids or to the catalogue. So this is kind of, it's all documented under the researcher's name. You can find the researcher, but you have to know that that researcher, for instance, in this instance, had been working with the Quiapo Indians in Brazil in order to then kind of find that information that's sitting within this box. So we're at Local Contexts kind of, you know, being very responsive to the legacies of copyright law and kind of the ways in which traditional intellectual property has excluded Indigenous interests. It was never a law that was created for Indigenous people, and therefore it has inbuilt colonial logics of exclusion as part of it. And kind of the way in which we have developed the labels and the notices is really moving from a language of property to one of establishing Indigenous cultural authority. The labels and the notices are not legal tools because Indigenous communities do not have legal rights over these collections, but they are extra legal in the sense that they work outside the already existing legal system of intellectual property and copyright and Creative Commons licenses. So we at Local Context believe that institutions and data repositories have a responsibility to disclose Indigenous collections. This kind of point that if you can't govern Indigenous data unless you know where that is, or unless you can find it, kind of pushes that responsibility back to institutions to start making clear and visible and disclosures about Indigenous collections so that Indigenous communities can start asserting their authority and control back into these spaces. One of the first tools that we have to do this at an institutional standpoint is the Local Context notices. We have 4 notices: the engagement notice, which is really kind of indicating that an institution is starting to do this kind of work around decolonial efforts around recognizing whose interests sit within the institutional frameworks, but then the kind of disclosure around attribution being incomplete, but also that there is existing biocultural or traditional knowledge that's kind of sitting within these collections as well.
So I'll just be speaking a little about the two of the notices that we have, and Corrie will share about the others. So this first notice is called Attribution Incomplete, and this is used by institutions to indicate that they are aware that they have collections or items in their institution that are either missing attribution or have inaccurate attribution. And this notice is used to indicate that they are interested in working with communities to correct that issue. And then below we have the Open to Collaborate notice, which is used to indicate that an institution is committed to developing new modes of engagement and partnership with Indigenous peoples in regard to the care and stewardship of their existing and future collections. And so that looks different at each institution. And in a moment, we'll be looking at some examples to see how different institutions are using this notice.
Thanks, Felicia. So these are the other 2 disclosure notices, and they correspond with the 2 categories of labels that we're going to talk about in a little bit: the traditional knowledge and biocultural, or TK and BC. The TK notice, it's about recognizing that there could be accompanying cultural rights, protocols, responsibilities that need further attention for future sharing and use of material or collections. The biocultural notice is about indicating Indigenous rights and interests around biodiversity and genetic materials. So these are materials derived from traditional lands, waters, and territories. And as we'll see in a minute, these notices can be placed at different scales. So from a single data set or cultural heritage item to a whole collection. But first, we're going to look at the different parts of a notice. I think, Felicia, you're going to do that.
Thanks, Corrie. So on the left, we have the icon, which does not change, and that's to maintain ease of recognizability across different contexts and across geographic regions, different platforms. We also have the title on the top. This one says TK notice, and that does not change. And then we have the description below, which also does not change, though institutions can include an optional use statement to contextualize their use of the notice on their site, and we'll see that in a couple examples. So this first example is from the Center for Native American and Indigenous Research at the American Philosophical Library's website. This is a great example because this is right on the homepage when you visit the Center for Native and American and Indigenous Research. It's bold, it's visible right at the top, and at the bottom they have a link. It's a little tiny, hard to see here, but it says, "What's this notice? Read more here." And if you click on that link, it'll take you to our website to learn more about the notices. But you can see that the text there is that same text that we shared earlier. They've just added CNAIR to the text to make it specific to their institution. This next example is a very popular image archive within Simon Fraser University's digitized collections. This collection contains images of Northwest Coast First Peoples, and you can see the notice is very bold and easily visible from this webpage right at the top next to the description of the archive. And then in the text there, they've also further contextualized it with information that specifically names the colonial provenance of the collection and their commitment to changing. And so this example just really demonstrates the way that institutions can still add context, even if the notice text itself is not customizable.
There's just a couple more to look at. So here we're looking at a screenshot from the University of Newcastle in Australia. This is their special collections website. And so the notice is a little bit lower on the page, which we can't see in the top screenshot. But what's really interesting is the notice is being used here alongside a cultural sensitivity warning, which is a great use of the notice, as well as other cultural contextual warnings. And then next we have an instance of the attribution incomplete being used with the Open to Collaborate, again on a website. This is from the Welcome Collection based in London. And they've applied these notices on their website on a specific page inviting Indigenous community contributions. And the collection sees these notices as part of their efforts to address their colonial roots, and they talk a little bit about that on this webpage. And this is really a first step for them towards building relationships of trust and collaboration. And then this next one is showing Open to Collaborate notice alongside a biocultural notice. And so this is a project based out of the University of Maine. It's for eDNA, or environmental DNA. And so this is a sampling project that's across Wabanaki Nation's lands and waters in Maine. And so they started with an Open to Collaborate notice across multiple websites, including this metadata site, which we see here. And they've also been adding biocultural notices for specific sampling sites where they know that the nations have biocultural interests that they want to register.
And then, so the notices can be used, as kind of Corrie and Felicia have said, at these different kinds of levels within an institutional context, and just really doing that kind of first iteration of making visible Indigenous collections, and then kind of this invitation to actually start working on the kind of like how bringing Indigenous authority back into these spaces. But the notices are also starting to be used by researchers and really kind of as a mark of researcher transparency when people are working with Indigenous communities. So this is the notices being included within ORCID profile records, particularly connected to new articles that are coming out. And then this next example is of the inclusion of notices on articles themselves. This is particularly important given the new machine learning technology that is creating different kinds of algorithms based off information that's coming out of articles. ChatGPT is doing that for sure. And kind of so publishers are starting to be really interested in including these notices as a means for at least recognizing that there are Indigenous interests sitting within this article at a top level. I just want to say that one of the things that we've just recently developed with the National Museum of the American Indian are these new collections care notices. You'll see these start to become more prominent over the next year or so. These are really kind of responding to Indigenous care guidelines within institutions themselves. This might be for material that is not yet able to be repatriated back to communities, but is sitting within institutions and has different kinds of levels of care and responsibility that sit around how they should be cared for and looked after within an institutional context. So if we have certain kinds of tools for institutions and researchers, we also have tools for Indigenous communities. And this is really where local context began. And so we kind of talked a little bit about the notices first, because we kind of see that as a responsibility for institutions. But we began with labels as a means for bringing Indigenous names, voices, protocols, provenance, permissions back into the record from where they should have been from the first place, but were for different kind of reasons of settler colonial collecting, was not actually included. So the labels really provide communities with an opportunity to add appropriate provenance, protocols, and permissions. So we have 20 traditional knowledge labels, really kind of speaking to different kinds of nuances that communities want to have recognized within the records. These have been developed over a 12-year period, working closely and in partnership with Indigenous communities to kind of identify what are these protocols that people want to have recognized and what do these look like. And I think that what's really important is kind of what we're pushing towards here. Like once you start at that kind of base level of acknowledgement, you actually then start to have to deal with attribution, authorship, moving to access, authority, accountability, and autonomy. We also more recently have the biocultural labels, which we've developed that really speak more to biocultural collections of plants, of seeds, of particular kinds of genomic sequences that kind of Corrie was speaking around, environmental DNA, and really kind of speaking to different kinds of data that is being collected from Indigenous lands and waters as well. So our project really spans the humanities and the sciences, really kind of speaking to the different relationships that sit and that Indigenous interests aren't necessarily divided by a certain kind of Enlightenment logic that separates out the humanities from the sciences. Yeah, I can continue on that as we go, but let's keep going. So this is just an example of 3 of the different kinds of labels that we have. We have a multiple communities label. This was always kind of one of the, in the suite, recognizing that there can be multiple community interests or overlapping community interests around particular kinds of information, particular kinds of songs, particular kinds of stories. Also kind of breaking the singularity of an institution or of a different kind of non-Indigenous researcher to control the narrative, that instead that there can be multiple community interests that are recognized in particular kinds of material. We have a seasonal label. This is one of my favorite labels in the sense that it recognizes that there are particular times of the year that certain stories should be told, or particular times of the year when certain stories shouldn't be told, and that there is a place-based relationship to the knowledge itself. So connecting knowledge and information back to lands and homelands from where it comes and from where meaning and different kinds of responsibilities sit. We also have the TK non-commercial label, which really speaks to Indigenous interests, saying how the material can be used and under what conditions, whether it can be used for commercial purposes or not. Some instances that's fine, but it's really important that it's communities that make those decisions, not third parties.
I'll be talking about the different parts of the label as well. So similar to the notice, there is this icon on the left side, circled or squared in orange. And similar to the notice, the icon does not change, just again to maintain ease of recognition across multiple contexts. However, the label differs in that it can be customized by Indigenous communities. So we have the title on the right. This one says TK attribution, and that is our template title, but communities are welcome to use that title or completely change it to suit their specific needs or context. And then below we have the description. This is our template text as well, which communities are welcome to use, but they can also completely customize this, and the default language can be in English or it can be in any other language, and communities are also able to utilize multiple translations of the label text as well. And here is a great example that we like to share. This is from the Scowlitz First Nation in what is currently known as British Columbia. So this is their website, and if you look on the top right, you can see 4 small labels: TK attribution, TK non-commercial, TK outreach, and TK verified. And so with any web page that you visit on their site, you will see these 4 labels at the top because they have applied them to the entire site to guide visitors appropriate interaction with the material that they've chosen to share. And in many instances, the tribe is the copyright holder of the material that they're sharing on the site, but they're still using the labels to guide respectful and appropriate interaction. So we've clicked on the TK attribution label so you can see their customized title and description. The title is in Hokumelam, and they've also included Hokumelam within the description as well. You can see at the top right that there's also a button to translate the labels to French. And this is just a great example to show the flexibility of the labels and how they can be customized to suit a community-specific needs.
And this is an example from the Library of Congress. Some of you may be familiar with. This was a project with the Passamaquoddy tribe in Maine. These were the first sound recordings that were made on Indigenous homelands in this country in March 1890. Passamaquoddy did not get access to these recordings until really recently. And so you can see from this record that there is very little information. And this is often what collections of Indigenous material look like, because Indigenous communities haven't been involved in engaging with that material. So this is an impoverished record. We know a little bit about the technology, but very little about the content of the recordings themselves. So this is starts to be the updated record that the Library of Congress now has. There's pages of traditional knowledge that has been shared by Passamaquoddy. There's new titles to the songs that the Passamaquoddy have determined should be there. And there's also the kind of 3 traditional knowledge labels that Passamaquoddy decided to utilize with this collection: the attribution that brings their name back into this record, very kind of like that kind of foremost way, but also kind of the outreach and the decision that these songs are being shared in order to kind of teach different kinds of publics about Passamaquoddy history, and then also the non-commercial label that there has been added as well. And partly adding these labels helped kind of Passamaquoddy feel that it was okay to share this traditional knowledge with the Library of Congress, because their authority was very clearly marked in this record in relationship to that information that was being shared. This led to some questions that the Library of Congress had about where do the labels sit in the rights advisory. They decided that they do sit in the rights advisory, and they actually decided that they sat above the legal rights holder at the time, which was the Peabody Museum of Archaeology and Ethnography at Harvard University. So they added them as cultural rights and as persistent rights under the rights advisory. This is a very significant move that the Library of Congress made in relationship to adding these labels. But as we know, so then one of the follow-up stories in relationship to this is that just recently Peabody decided to actually take their names off the rights advisory. They didn't want to be associated with this collection, and they understood that it's actually Passamaquoddy cultural rights that should always be consulted in the first instance. So that kind of act of removing themselves from the record is really significant in terms of kind of what the labels can do, and in terms of placing that we often got questions about, isn't there a tension between kind of having these cultural rights here and then also having the Harvard rights there? And that there, you know, yes, there is a tension there, but at least it's a little bit more transparent in relationship to how these rights came to be held by Harvard University, when there was kind of like little or no information about kind of what had happened to kind of make that the case. Here, then, you know, in that previous record, they're sitting next to each other, and that tension is a little bit more transparent. And then through this work, Harvard has kind of decided that actually the authority does sit with Passamaquoddy. They shouldn't be having that authority. And so they've decided to take themselves out of the record. So that's a significant change as well. But for, you know, getting into the digital infrastructures themselves, digital infrastructures are not neutral. They carry the bias of the kind of the society around them. And this is also the case for how the Library of Congress had to kind of think through where they were going to place the labels in the MARC record. They placed them in the data field 540, which is also usually reserved for rights holders. But consistent with the rights advisory, they included the labels in the data field 540. That has also then meant that they had a larger question about their JSON record and kind of what they needed to do for that. So they actually created a new field for traditional knowledge labels within their JSON record. What that means is now any community that has traditional knowledge labels can add them into the Library of Congress because the field now exists. So the contribution that the Passamaquoddy Nation have made into allowing and supporting other tribal nations to assert their authority into collections at the Library of Congress is significant. And it means that all of the work that we have done to kind of get that change within kind of one of the largest institutions in the United States is really significant and has significant flow on for future Indigenous communities that want to add their labels. There are about 8 communities that are working to add their labels now into the Library of Congress with that kind of work that Passamaquoddy kind of started. So this is also an example. So the labels are used in so many different kinds of contexts, and we don't really have time to show you as many of them as we would like. They're used in curriculum, they're used in libraries, they're used in museums, they're used in different kinds of spaces. But they're also used, as kind of Felicia spoke, in unique community projects. And this is an example of an app that comes from Whakatohia Nation. They have an app called the Whakatohia Waiata, which allows access to a variety of community songs and community chants. They've added the labels into that app, and you can download the app online if you want to have a look at it. And as a non-Whakatohia citizen, you would only get access to about 6 different Waiata songs. If you are from Whakatohia, you get access to all of the songs, but they've added the labels to every song to kind of really, again, provide that guidance in relationship to how that song should be heard, what the responsibilities and obligations are, but also to kind of indicate that this has actually been verified through a community process. And that also has kind of been really important, using the verified label.
Great, so I'm just going to end with one more example of labels in use alongside a notice as well. So this example really shows the large scale that labels and notices can be applied at. I'm going to be talking about Manaki Whenua, or Land Care Research, which is a research institution based in Aotearoa, New Zealand. They hold a nationally significant collection of biological samples that have been collected from around the world, but most of them are from New Zealand. So here's just a representation of their collection, just to kind of think about the scale of this. So they have over 675,000 records. And within these records, 6,000 biocultural labels have been applied. And on every single record, they've applied a biocultural notice. So that's 675,000 biocultural notices, which is really exciting. So how did they actually do this? Can take a look at that. So this is their overall collection, and it's divided into these smaller collections that you see here, such as arthropods or herbarium. And so Manaki Whenua has applied a biocultural notice to each of these smaller collections. And then that notice was added to each of the records within the collection. And they're able to do that using our local context hub and our API, which we will talk about shortly. So that's how the notice was added to a selection of the records. There's also biocultural labels added. And so there's 3 iwi, 3 nations in New Zealand that applied labels to the records. So we have Te Rauroa, Whakatohia, and Ngāti Maru or Taranaki that have applied biocultural labels to just about 6,000 records. So take a closer look at that next. So many of the samples have geolocation data, so they're able to be mapped. Many of you might be familiar with Native Land Digital, which is an online resource to map Indigenous homelands and waters. And so Manaki Whenua added a filter to their database based on Native Land Digital, and they're able to filter their collection by whose lands or whose waters the samples were collected from. So what we're seeing here on this map is the 1,300 or so entries that have been collected from the Rohi, the territory of Whakatohia. And so Whakatohia used the local context hub to apply labels to this selection of 1,300 records. And so this is what an entry actually looks like. You can see the labels as well as the notice here. And so they've been added to the permissions or the permit field here. And so these are the 4 labels that Whakatohia has added to those records: the provenance, research use, open to collaboration, and open to commercialization. And so those have been added to all 1,300. And by clicking on any one of these, actually, you'll see a pop-up that has the text from Whakatohia for each of their labels. And the same is for the notice, which again isn't customized, but you can also access the text here. And so I think Jane's going to talk a little bit about the local context hub, which is how all of that was able to happen.
Yeah, so this all happens through what's called the local context hub, where you kind of register. So both institutions and communities come into the local context hub, create an account. If you're from a community, you are able to then start customizing your labels. If you're from an institution, you can start utilizing the notices and connecting into communities that are both within the hub and outside the hub. With particular kinds of projects. Those projects could be around a particular item or a particular collection that institution wants to work with community around. There's a notification component that sits within the hub. And then the notices and the labels all have permanent identifiers that kind of connect through. And so you kind of have this kind of machine readability that is part of how we've developed the labels and the notices. This is all delivered through an open API, which we have created. This is just a kind of API overview of some of the information that the API delivers. We have an API guide that helps institutions implement local context labels and notices into the different infrastructures. It's just an image of the API guide that's available on the local context site that Felicia has already put into the chat. And just in relationship to some of the larger implementation questions, we have had to think about really different kinds of contexts of implementation of the labels and notices, really different systems, really different data fields. But one of the exciting examples that we have is that the archive space has just developed a plugin that allows for anybody who's utilizing archive space to also then use local context. So Joshua Shaw from Dartmouth spent a lot of time developing this plugin. It's in operation. It's really, really exciting. It allows for kind of the pull of local context project data into archive space in a seamless way. We've got institutions that are just starting to use that now, which is really exciting. And there's a range of different kinds of technical questions that this is not my field necessarily, but certainly thinking about wanting to do implementation of the local context notices and labels, we have a technical implementation working group where we kind of, people who are working on this kind of part of local context work can meet and kind of talk to each other and kind of gain insights in relationship to how that implementation is happening. I'll just say one of our current projects is thinking about what an Indigenous metadata block should look like. This is kind of connected not only into kind of the labels and notices work, but into kind of larger work that we're doing around the care principles, and also the development of a recommended practice around the provenance of Indigenous people's data. That has kind of been a project that we've been working on for the last 3 years with the IEEE. We're having an Indigenous metadata symposium in May, kind of really thinking about kind of what that should look like across kind of Darwin core, Dublin core, Dataverse, DataSite, the different kinds of spaces where we're seeing the desire to utilize and to disclose Indigenous collections, but also to utilize the labels from Indigenous communities to bring that authority as part of the future metadata of collections. I'll just finish by also saying that we are hosting a local context summit in May 10 in Lenape-Hoking in person, and it'll be streamed on live. This is our first summit where we're able to bring all different kinds of people who are working on local contexts, from community potential and communities that are utilizing the labels to institutions that are utilizing the labels, and also researchers that are kind of thinking through and working with the labels and the notices as well. I would just also say it's like really exciting to be presenting this in New Mexico. We've had a lot of engagement in New Mexico. We've been really honored to also have been able to present this work to the All Pueblo Council of Governors, and to kind of really see the excitement that sits in relationship to the potential of utilizing the labels and the notices in a New Mexico context. So thank you for inviting us to share this more widely within the library sector. And we'll just kind of finish there. I'm sure there's some questions, but we did also want to do a hub demo for you that kind of just demonstrates a little bit more about how you kind of join the hub, how you set up a project, and how the internal machinations of the hub actually work.
And I just mentioned a couple of our things here that we have resources for. So we do have our website, which Felicia's already dropped. You're welcome to email us. That will reach our whole team. We also are on social media. We'd love to have you following us: Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn. We also have working groups or networks that we'd love to have you join. You can email us at support@localcontext.org, and we'd be happy to add you.
I also added a link to an introductory video in the chat. It's a great quick intro to local context and easy to share if you want to share with any of your colleagues.
And I'll just say we'll also have a film that we've created with the Penobscot Nation in Maine that has just kind of been documenting not only their use of the labels as a particular mechanism, but the kind of larger work that they've been doing in reclaiming their collections. And that film will be out on the 10th of May, and we'll be happy to share that with you as well, but really tells the story from a community standpoint. So I think we should maybe just keep going and just show you the local context hub, and then that will be about 10 minutes, and then we'd have enough time for questions, if that's okay. Okay, great.
Awesome. So I'm just logging in. We have a sandbox or test hub as well. So that's what we're going to be using for the demo today. You're welcome to check that out if you'd like to see what the hub is about. Give it a whirl. So I'm here in my account. I think we're going to create a new account just so we can see that process. There is a registration process for you as an individual, which is fairly straightforward, as you would sign up for any other site. But the creation of an account is somewhat unique here. So here we are on choosing an account type. So we have 3 account types here on the Local Context Hub. We have community accounts, which are for Indigenous communities, entities or representatives. And so those accounts are going to be able to customize and apply the TK and BC labels. We have institution accounts, which are for institutions, data repositories, other organizations that have Indigenous materials, but are going to be issuing notices. And then we have researcher accounts, which are for individuals. They might be associated with an institution, they might be associated with the community, but this is really for an individual who is doing their own independent research. They might be putting out publications, collecting or creating data. And so that account is for individuals. The community and institution account are for multiple people. But I think let's look at the institution account creation process, because I think many of you are going to be in that category. So you can either join an account that already exists, but we'll create one today just to look at that. This step is not going to be present on the test site, but we do ask for confirmation from an institutional representative that you can join the hub as that institution. And so we'll ask for an email or a signed letter from that representative in order to join the hub. But we'll ask for some basic information. And so we use the ROR.org as our database for institutions. So you will need to select your country first, and then your institution type. Now, these aren't might not totally match what you think about as your institution. And so linked below here is ROR. So you can actually look yourself up in their database and see what you're categorized as. But we'll select education for today. We'll create an account for maybe New York University. So there's going to be a really long list here that you'll be able to find yourself. University press, maybe. Let's say we're applying some notices to some publications. And then you can enter some basic information here. And you can enter a short description up to 200 characters that I will leave blank for today. And once you've entered that information, again, you'll need to go through the confirmation. You'll receive an email from us in order to do that. But you will have your institution account here. You can see I have a couple different accounts that we'll look at today. But maybe we'll go into this Museum of Science account, just because it's one that we use quite often for demos. And maybe we'll create a project, because that's one of the main activities I'll say in the hub. Felicia, I'm wondering, maybe do you want to introduce the projects to us?
Sure. So within the Local Context Hub, you can create a project, and this is what you use to notify a community. And so a project can really be anything, and maybe it's something that you think about differently from what you might consider a project at your institution. So this can be a single item or an entire collection. And so this is the process that you would use for the TK, BC, and attribution incomplete notice. The open to collaborate workflow is different. So you would go to the project page and first decide which notice or notices you would like to use. And so you select those, and it shows you a preview of the notice text. And then you would scroll down to enter some basic high-level project information.
Yeah, so next you would be entering kind of like a summary of information about this project. So you can select from this dropdown what your project type is. We have here, it's kind of small, so I'll read them: item, collection, samples, expedition, publication, exhibition, and other. In case none of those quite fit, you can enter your own. We'll say we're doing a collection for today. And we'll imagine that we're going to be sending this project to the Southwest community, which is also a fake account that we're going to be using for demonstration purposes. So let's say this is the Southwest Community Collection within the Museum of Science. So we'll give a title to the project, and you can enter a short description about this project. So you might say what is within the collection, how big it is, but you don't need to include necessarily everything that you know about this collection, which is probably a lot, especially if you're able to add an external link to perhaps your website, a database, where more information can be found. I'm going to keep it very short today, just so that we can get through this process and look at it. Next, you'll enter project contacts. So who is the best person to get in touch with about this project? It might be the person that is creating it, or it might be someone else. We'll say it is for me today. And then you can also add contributors. So this is for other accounts that are on the hub. It could be a community, an institution, or a researcher. And so these are all the accounts that are registered in the test hub. You can also start to type and find people that way. Or you can invite people by name and email as well. Felicia, do you mind jumping in about the project information?
Sure. So down at the bottom, we have some optional project information. And so these are identifiers or metadata that's already associated with the project. So the first option is the provider's project ID. So that is an identifier from your particular collections management system. You're welcome to enter that there. Below, we have the project data GUID, and that's more applicable to scientific or genomic data. And then below, we have the DOI, which is affiliated with the publication. And so all of this is optional, but if you have any of these identifiers, you're welcome to add them here so that they are affiliated with the project.
Thanks, Felicia. And then the last thing before you save is to select the visibility. So there's different visibility levels for this project, whether you want it to be accessible by the public or only by contributors or only visible to yourself. We'll leave it public for today and save it. And then we should go back to our project list here. So I didn't scroll down earlier, but this is a list of all the projects that we have either created or our contributor are here in this account. So this is just kind of a summary of what we're working on, but by clicking on any of the titles, we can see more information. So this is the more detailed view of the project. We can see all the information that we've just entered. We also have the project ID, which is important for using with our API. It is a unique identifier that is generated whenever you create a project. We also have the URL, which since this is a public project, you can copy and paste that and send it to people to see the project. And then we see the notices that we've selected here. As well as some other information. So we have project comments and project activity. Just so the comments are for talking with other contributors on the project, and then the project activity kind of keeps a record of what's been going on in the project. So that's the information. And then up top here, we have actions that we can do. Let's notify a community today. These other buttons are for sharing, downloading, kind of managing your project. So I'm going to send this to Southwest community. You can send it to multiple communities at once, notify multiple communities, but we're just going to share it with the Southwest community for today. And so I'll send the notification. Okay, and so we see now that the Southwest community down here has been notified. And so I'm going to go back to my profile page. I'm a member of that community as well. That's normally not going to be the case, but just for the ease of the demo today, we're going to go into that community account now. And maybe Felicia, you want to talk about the different actions a community can do when they receive a project?
Sure. So the key difference between the community account and the institution account is that the community account can customize and apply labels. So Corrie had clicked on the project notification, and here we can see the same project view that we just saw from the institution, but there are a couple of different options here for the community. So you can see this project status section where the community can select the status. So we can acknowledge the notice, let the institution know that we've seen the project, but maybe haven't made a decision as to whether we'd like to apply labels. We can select labels pending if we'd like to apply labels, but need to customize some new ones or haven't decided which ones. Or if we don't feel that this project needs any labels or we just don't wish to apply them, we can select no labels pending. And then at the bottom, you can see there's a grayed out option, labels applied, which will automatically be selected as the status once the community applies labels. And so up here in the action section, we have the option as a community to apply labels. And so these are all of the labels that have been customized by the Southwest community. The account is set up to be very collaborative, so there needs to be at least 2 members in the account to customize labels and approve them for application to projects. So these are not all of the BC and TK labels that are available. These are just the ones that have been customized and approved for use. And so even though only the TK notice was sent over, the community can still select a BC label if they feel that's appropriate for the project. So Corrie is going to select a couple of different labels, can select many at once, and it will give you a preview of the customized title and description. I think we use the template text for all of these, but they can be customized by the community, and that's what you would see here. There's also this community note function at the bottom where the community can add notes about their choice to apply labels or any specific information about the project that they wish to only have visible to members of the community. So this is just for members of this account. It won't be visible to the institution. And Corrie will select apply. And it brings you back to this page where you can see those labels applied, but you can also go back at any time and remove labels or add new ones or apply new labels to the project. So now you can see the project page has been updated with the labels that were selected. And down below,
so,
go ahead.
Go ahead, Felicia.
You go ahead, Corrie.
I was just going to say that that has also been recorded in the project activity. The institution that shared this project would receive a notification as well as an email that the labels have been added. Yeah, I think that's a quick demo, but I think that's where we'll stop for today and take questions.
Thanks, Corrie and Felicia. That was a great demo. So you can kind of see what's behind the hood and how this kind of functions. Okay, so that was an enormous amount of information, and I'm really excited by it, but also really, I think we've got about 20 minutes for questions or different kinds of observations, questions that you might have. Hi, Jonathan. It's lovely to see you.
Thank you so much. I am going to go ahead and stop the recording.